After all of the appeals, a judge has decided that Mark Carver is entitled to a new trial, a do-over. A trial do-over to again avail himself of the benefits of a trial by his peers. Logically, then, he now reverts back to his original position, having been arrested, charged, and now held, free only after posting bond, because the state, it has now been judicially determined, has probable cause to suspect Mark Carver of first-degree murder. Conversely, the state, county prosecutors, officials, investigators, both local and statewide, have also won a do-over. For investigators, they are not now bound only to the facts that were available to them in 2008. In other words, they are now free to conduct a re-investigation all over again. And likely in some respects are doing that as we speak. They could discover new facts and still arrive at the same conclusion in an even stronger position than they were before, based on the same theories or completely different theories. And of course, they're free not to reinvestigate at all, should they choose. No law binds them to anything in terms of what they may now or may now not choose to investigate or conclude. So they have won a do-over, as well as prosecutors. They can retry their case in any manner they see fit, based upon the facts they've always had, new facts, opining the same or different theories, as they please. Now, I'm not a mind reader or a weatherman, but if someone asked me for the climate around here, I'd say officials are convinced only 3 people know what happened on the riverbanks that morning, and 2 of them are dead. But if someone were to ask me for the weather, now that's a different thing. You see, the climate's what we expect. The weather's what we don't. There's no telling how this story will unfold, as it is unfolding in real time before our very ears. On another note, I hope we can all agree the guests on this podcast are, at the very least, very cool. And I think you'll find in most cases are experts in their respective field. We enjoy their colorful commentary and invite fresh perspective, as it makes great conversation, doesn't it? And in that vein, and with all due respect, the ideas and views shared by our guests are not necessarily the ideas and views of myself, Ben Cazzo, or Fedora Media, the executive producers of this podcast. Well, let's not delay the inevitable any longer. After all, I'm glad you're here. It's really only the first night, isn't it? It's been spread out there on the dining room table, that puzzle, as we've been distracted with a number of things in our humble abode. We've walked by the dining room a number of times, and each time have glanced in passing at those pieces, lying there in the dim light. Why, the fragments themselves have formed shadows by now. They've taken on a sort of ominous glow, lying there silently. Are they mocking us? Why? Of course not. Come now. Let us retire for the evening. But before we go, one last peek, shall we? Yes. We do marvel at the intricacy as we reconsider the figure on the package. Oh well, I guess there's been no progress tonight. At least that we're aware of. It's always a good night's rest, isn't it? That's the key. Why, in the morning our eyes will be keener, sharper, like a razor, able to discern similarities never noticed heretofore. We may then be able to observe prevalent shapes and colors that we had hitherto overlooked just the night before. Oh, what a difference one night can make, can't it? But why, that's elementary, isn't it, my dear Watson?
Fresh eyes. Yeah, and I think it's deep human instinct to want to sort of set right a wrong, solve a mystery, set right a wrong, sort of reestablish equilibrium, or to heal, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
So it's not just special techniques. Everybody wants, they don't want people who are not guilty to be punished, and they don't want people who are culpable to wander around with no consequence. So I think everyone starts kind of from the same place as a human being.
That's Watson. Stuart Watson, that is. Investigative reporter extraordinaire. Graduate of Harvard University's Nieman Fellowship for Journalism. Served 16 years at NBC affiliate WCNC-TV here in Charlotte, North Carolina, before retiring from an illustrious and distinguished career, during which he garnered 10 regional Emmys, captivating viewers' attention for years with hard-hitting, fact-based, and ethical investigative reporting. Fondly referred to by Fedora staff as, who else? Dr. Watson.
It kind of reminds me of an episode of the X-Files or something where Mulder's always, he's got to get to the truth, whether it be extraterrestrials, New Mexico,
Government conspiracies.
government conspiracy.
Yes, people want to know what happened, and a lot of times getting at the truth is not a straight line. It's not really easy. And so if there gets to be an easy narrative, if the wife is dead, look at the husband, and so there's an easy narrative. To me, everything about this case in particular revolves around context, or any case. Just like an archaeologist can't just take something in a museum case and tell you that much about it. Everything about the context of where something is found establishes its meaning. And so if you take one piece of physical evidence outside of a context, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. If you have a piece of trace DNA, that has to be put within the context of the science, but also where was it, and how else, what does it mean? What's the difference between trace DNA and any other kind of DNA? And what's the nature of the science? And then where was it found? And then, okay, there's one explanation for how that was there. What are other explanations for how that DNA, this is not the proverbial smoking gun, but we, a lot of times, just as humans, we want to resolve things in our minds. If someone establishes a relatively simple narrative, then we'll want to buy into that. Does that make sense? And a lot of times, the vast majority of murders, this not being one of them, are pretty straightforward. Someone was robbing someone. There's an old defense attorney in Toledo, Ohio, when I worked there. He used to say, a murder is an assault where someone dies. If a person doesn't die, it's not a murder. If someone's assaulted and they do die, that's a murder. Because you rarely unintentionally, otherwise it would be an accidental death. It might be a homicide, but if it's a murder, someone intended to hurt someone, even if they didn't intend to kill them, they intended to hurt someone seriously, and then the person died. It's the death that makes it the murder. Otherwise, it's just assault with intent to kill or inflict serious injury. That's one crime, or assault, or whatever. But the notion of that intentionality. And so when a medical examiner or a homicide detective or a crime scene investigator, whenever they arrive and there's someone who's dead, they have to quickly, by looking at the surroundings, ascertain, is this suicide? Does this appear to be a natural death? Does this appear to be a homicide? There's only so many roads you can go, but when you first, I have a dear friend who took his own life. The first thing that happened is our mutual friends discover his body. It appears to be a suicide because of the surroundings and because of what he said to many, many people leading up to it. He had talked about committing suicide for years, months, if not years. But the cops who arrive there and flood the house, they have to not operate within that context. They have to operate with fresh eyes and say, we need to rule out that this was not just made to look like a suicide. Well, it needs to start with nobody having a theory at all. You don't have a theory, you have a body. And so you need to start without a theory. It's the same as an investigative reporter starting on a story. If I have a theory or a narrative, that's going to skew. If I'm looking for, in medicine they say, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras, because there are a lot more horses around, And so that's the first thing you're thinking. But really, it's probably horses, but we have to at least consider, it might be a unicorn. You have to be like, am I open to it being a unicorn? Yeah, it could be. I've never seen it before, but I'm open to it. So let's just see if first of all, let's eliminate through some pretty quick work there on the scene. You can kind of resolve these things pretty quickly, and especially with the autopsy and the tox screen. So they take all the photos they need to take and collect all the little vials of, fibers or hair or semen or blood or whatever on the scene. And then they take all the photographs they need to take and, do all the measurements they need to do. And then they move the body, and that takes hours. So my friends, in the case of my buddy's suicide, they had to sit there in the other room and wait while these cops and then family members are arriving, and it's just really a terrible kind of a thing. It's terrible for those of us who are still here on this plane, especially if we cared about that individual. But the cops are doing their job. They're being methodical. The flip side of that would be my sister died this year, and the cops, she's out in the country, and she had been terribly ill, and the person who decides the cause of death was an EMT. The EMT is the elected coroner. He signs the death certificate. There's no autopsy and there's no tox screen. Well, that's because they're putting together the context of what the family has told them and everything else. If they wanted an autopsy, that means it's up to my brother-in-law, her husband, to pay for that, because the Georgia Bureau of Investigation said our morgue is slap full of people who have, bullet holes in their body. Don't be sending us the 1/100th of 1% chance that this is not a quote-unquote natural death. Don't be sending it to us because we don't have the room, we don't have the bandwidth to do that. So what that means is I'm relying, and the family, my mother, my brother, her sons, her daughter, everybody is relying on the context. She had been to the ER 2 nights before. She had been vomiting and had diarrhea. She was emaciated. She was dehydrated. She's, there's all these things that lead toward it, but they're relying upon the context to know that this was not a homicide or a suicide, that this was a quote-unquote natural death. The only job of ambulance guys say, yep, we don't need to transport her to a hospital to try to revive her. There's not a faint heartbeat. Yep, she's dead. Right after that, it becomes the job of law enforcement to consider all the circumstances and decide whether this merits any more investigation. So any kind of investigating officer, detective or homicide investigator, a crime scene investigator, begins by trying to have eyes wide open, 360, to try to have a clear mind, to be present in the moment, to see everything they need to see, to determine whether there are alternative explanations, something that doesn't fit within the scene. A woman that we spent a lot of time investigating when I was doing this work in television, who her death was quickly ruled a homicide, but there were all kinds of things about the situation that did not make sense, right down to where the gun was jammed, the trajectory of the bullet, where if she was right-handed or left-handed, and there are powder burns on the other hand. There are all kinds of things that you would have to resolve in your own mind to say this is a homicide. So her husband standing there and screaming about this is terrible, she killed herself. Okay, duly noted, you say she killed herself. Now let's look at all the rest of the physical evidence to see if it substantiates what you're saying or if it contradicts what you're saying. Like, well, help me understand how this happened. If she killed herself, like, where did she get the gun? How was she holding the gun? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How did this happen? And then to look at that narrative and compare it against what the physical evidence does. And that ultimately becomes the job of the jury too, to say, given the totality of what we know about the defendant and the totality of what we know about the circumstances, does this fit? Does this make sense? Is this way beyond any kind of nagging question or doubt?
Having gathered the facts thus far, Watson, I sat and smoked several pipes over them, trying to separate which ones were crucial from others which were merely incidental.
So you have circumstances or evidence, like facts. There is such a thing as facts that we can all, sign off on. We can all say, yeah, okay, we see the same thing. Okay, you say that this man killed this woman. Okay, you saying it does not make it so. No matter how many, gold braids you have on your shoulder, no matter how many badges say that, it doesn't make it so unless there is some kind of corroboration. Just saying it so doesn't make it so. That's putting an awful lot of faith in a kind of a single source. There's one microphone on this table. All right. So are we agreed at that? Well, there's some clickers down at the end of the table. There's my bag on the table, but we only see one microphone on this table. All right, so you and I agree on that. So if I said, well, why does the sound like it came from different microphones? Then I would have to pursue alternative explanations. Maybe there's a microphone in my bag. Maybe there was a microphone I didn't see. Maybe there was a microphone under the table. Maybe there was one in the ceiling. So all of this boils down to, how do I know what I know? How do we know that? And then to accumulate as many differing corroborating points as we can. And then to look at everything which corroborates or substantiates this storyline. And then, but to keep eyes wide open. Now, what is it that contradicts, negates, breaks down that story? Well, wait a minute. That couldn't be true because this. We can always ask more questions than there will ever be evidence, but we have to substantiate way beyond a reasonable doubt. We really need to know, A, that it was a murder, B, that this was the guy. I don't care how many degrees they have, how much of an expert in forensic science they are. They just explain in layman's terms what the DNA means, or what the blood spatter means, or whatever. And then you have to come behind that and say, well, wait a minute, is this settled time? How do we know? Like, what was the blood spattered that way, and how does this guy know? And is that, our entire justice system depends upon us not just taking one version, one story. And I think I've always questioned authority. I think it makes me a better citizen. And in the world of journalism and investigative reporting in particular, the more powerful someone is, the more scrutiny they should face. There's a healthy amount of pushback which is necessary in a healthy democracy. And a lot of that is cops have guns. Cops have tons of power. Cops can kill people, and prosecutors can send innocent people to prison for a long time. There needs to be a civilian in the box who's like, wait a minute, we'll all go home to bed. But before we go home to our families to dinner with the kids, let's not spend the rest of our lives wondering if we sent the wrong guy to prison.
Fedora is a true crime media podcasting company, and to that end, we must be particularly concerned with what we in the business call entertainment. Rain or shine, yes, you've heard it before, the show must go on. We lay no claim to be experts in the field of criminal investigations per se. Fedora, at the end of the day, is producing entertainment. Upon Fedora's arrival here in Charlotte, an acquaintance was kind enough to introduce the Fedora staff to the venerable Mr. Watson. Think about, just for a minute, the complexity of this case. A young college student last seen up around campus running errands, not a care in the world.
2 hours later discovered strangled, lying beside her car on the banks of the Catawba River, all the way on the other side of town, in an area that most agreed would have been wholly strange to her. Some, even to this day, have claimed she committed suicide, while others, close to the scene that day, contend there's no way that she could have done that to herself. Then we have 2 fishermen just downriver from where she was found, are eventually arrested and charged with her murder. They're cousins, scheduled to be tried separately. One cousin dies the day before his trial is supposed to start, while the remaining cousin is eventually found guilty of first-degree murder. To this very day, he maintains his innocence, and the North Carolina Center for Actual Innocence has stepped in to fight for what they believe is a man who's been wrongfully convicted for something he didn't do, and has in fact won him the right to have a new trial. This decision is currently being appealed by the district attorney. Every major news outlet in Charlotte has been covering the twists and turns of this tragedy since 2008, as it's worked its way through the legal system. At the end of all of that, nobody is in complete agreement as to whether or not Ira Yarmolenko in fact committed suicide or was indeed murdered. And if she was murdered, who did it? Was it indeed Mark Carver, the one fisherman who was originally convicted for it? Or was it some other monster who's still roaming the streets somewhere? Well, one thing that everybody will likely agree on is that nobody knows for sure what happened. Well, not yet anyway. So in an effort to guide Fedora's investigative podcast in this case, and considering the aforementioned complexity of it, perhaps we may also all agree that 2 heads are better than 1. We may even agree that 4 heads are better than 2. Fedora naturally intends to seek outside professional expertise, in this case, whenever available and wherever appropriate. The skills honed by Mr. Watson through years of hard-nosed investigative reporting, skills designed to arrive at the truth, are, of course, invaluable.
Like a great many investigative reporters at a professional organization called Investigative Reporters and Editors, through a book called The Reporter's Handbook, there's a great deal of faith in documents. Now that doesn't mean you have to know the context of the document, and you have to know where did the document come from. The context of a document is as important as the document. If somebody puts pieces of paper with printing on them under your door or in the transom or in your mailbox, and you open them up and it says it's Donald Trump's tax returns, you just know that the printing on that page says it's Donald Trump's tax returns. You don't know that it's his actual tax returns. Anybody can print up anything. You have to know where did the document come from. So if I approach the medical examiner's office in North Carolina, I operate with a reasonable amount of faith that in this case, they're not sending me something that has been faked, forged, altered, or made up, that it's not fiction, that if they say blood alcohol was whatever it was, that's what it was. That's what the instruments said that it was. And so in a death investigation, autopsy is documentation, autopsy science is going to tell us some things. It's going to look at this with clear eyes. It's going to say, okay, how many bullet holes were there? Where were they? What was the trajectory, et cetera, et cetera? What were the, when the body arrived, it had such, thus and so, As the first bit of science done, it starts the questions. It begins, that document starts the questions.
So we agree that there are professionals in the field of criminal investigations, and that's what they do, whether they be investigative journalists like Dr. Watson or law enforcement detectives. And as with any class of professionals, within that group there are varying degrees of competency. Just like doctors, there may be doctors who are good or average or exceptional, and some even on a class all by themselves. They have some sort of natural gift that sets them above the rest of their peers. Mr. Watson would be in the category of the latter, of course. It is interesting to note, however, that police across the country will readily admit to the fact that they rely on the general community participation to be their eyes and ears during many criminal investigations. After all, when the tips stop coming in, cases can grow cold. So there is an interesting sort of dynamic involved. On the one hand, we have skilled professionals in the art of criminal investigation. Yet on the other hand, we have the community. Their involvement is important because we know, and it's a fact, when the tips stop coming in, cases grow cold. Even within the community itself, there are individuals possessing various skills to varying degrees, which may be able to assist law enforcement. Some people are especially gifted in the area of observation, knowing if something looks out of place at a given time, and then being able to recollect that at the appropriate time to communicate that to law enforcement to be of assistance in any particular incident. There may be others in the community who are especially intuitive. Maybe they just have a sixth sense about who they feel might have done something. Believe then in your power. The power of humble observation, the efficacy of extraordinary intuition, the potential leverage of logical deduction, for these are powers possessed by each one of us in varying degrees. Remember that, at least metaphorically speaking, the community is the eyes and ears of law enforcement.
We don't grow up without a kind of a meta story, or without a whole bunch of stories that we've already signed on to. If you ever hear that somebody is just they're just Hitler, they're just evil, they're a monster, they're irredeemable, they're just not even human, all of my red flags go up when I hear that. People are complicated. And I don't care if you're Hitler. You can't be Hitler. You're not Hitler all the time. Hitler wasn't Hitler, until a certain point. He's just this boy who's just rejected, dejected art student who had, physical malformations, et cetera, and then he evolved into that. Well, the same thing is true if you hear about the saints Oh, she was Mother Teresa. She never lost. If you're a prosecutor who wants to collect scalps, if you're just going for your batting average, how many convictions, if you just want to hang them high, right? You just want to send a lot of people to death row to let them know that in this county, boy, we have the law. And we're not going to stand for these killings down here. Well, if you're just after that, then it's in your interest to make that guy as hateable as possible, to where you'll have no qualms sitting in that jury room for sending him to prison for the rest of his days, or to the gas chamber or the electric chair or whatever. That you'll have no qualms with that because, I don't feel bad about that at all because he was just evil, So I was being a good citizen and doing what I had to do.
And there were some on the Fedora staff who questioned whether tracing Ira's footsteps that day, trying to pinpoint her final movements, as well as previewing the layout of the crime scene and where everybody was at, whether or not these were appropriate starting points for this investigative podcast. After listening to Mr. Watson, these questions need to be answered, as well as many others.
Particularly when something as suspicious as this, or just not write off anything. Attention to detail is everything. To be able to see things with a completely open mind. What do we know? What is it we're assuming? Are we assuming she drove herself?
We have reached the conclusion of episode 7. A Body Lying There, a Fedora production. Fedora would like to give special thanks to Stuart Watson for his contribution to this episode. We'll hear more from him in the future. In the meantime, listeners may want to check out his latest project, a podcast he hosts entitled simply Man Listening, all one word. Join Stuart each week as he interviews incredible women who have overcome impossible odds. Fedora would also like to invite the listener to check out a YouTube channel entitled True Crime Carolinas, The Mark Carver Story, where Ken Lemon presents a special emphasizing Mark Carver's side of this case. If you believe in Mark Carver's innocence, you may want to make a tax-deductible donation to the North Carolina Center for Actual Innocence, who needs your support. You may do so by going to their website at nccai.org. Going to the homepage, in the upper right-hand corner, there is a Contribute Now button. If, on the other hand, you believe that the jury of 12 got it right the first time when they convicted Mark Carver, you may want to support local law enforcement efforts with your tax-deductible donations. That would be the city of Mount Holly, North Carolina. You may send your funds to 400 East Central Avenue, Mount Holly, North Carolina, 28120, or the County of Gaston, North Carolina, 128 West Main Avenue, Gastonia, North Carolina, 28053. Fedora is both independent of and not affiliated to either of the aforementioned individuals, organizations, or agencies.